Welcome to NEK-TV Rocks. And my guest today, again, finally, is Ed Stanak, who's a recovering state employee. Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Pam.
It took more than 2 years.
I know.
Anyway, what you got for us?
Well, I thought we could begin by talking about legislation that was passed in 2024. One of the so-called big, beautiful bills on the state level. Act 181, 170 pages long, and it has to deal with Act 250, but also housing, related amendments to the tax laws in Vermont, and things like that. So I thought that would be a good starting point.
It's a very good starting place, and it's very important.
Absolutely.
And impacts on all of us, whether we pay attention to the numbers as they're happening or not. Go for it.
So a major piece of the bill was they created a new board to administer Act 250. It's called the Land Use Review Board. And the legislature immediately charged that board with conducting studies on the appeal process of permits, studies on, jurisdiction, which is like who needs to get a permit, topics like that. And, beginning with appeals, this whole thing is wrapped around the axle of housing. I'm the first to admit there's a huge housing crisis going on in Vermont.
Ain't that the truth?
But it didn't begin yesterday. It didn't begin 10 years ago. In fact, Act 250 back in the 1990s was the first process that began to identify with great blinking lights, housing crisis. And district commissions identified that as expansions of ski areas were proposed with bringing in new employees. And so long story made short was these district commissions began to identify the burden on local housing markets from the expansions and started attaching impact fees. Well, the powers that be freaked out.
Didn't like impact
Immediately
fees.
went to the legislature, said you got to control these Act 250 district commissions. But I only bring that up because the flags were flying already in the 1990s. What happened since then, such that we have this crisis right now? So just setting the stage, with this law, they said go out and study housing. We want to do something with housing. They created huge exemptions from Act 250 in the name of housing.
Interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah.
So now the problem belongs to the little towns.
Right. Well, peeling back the so-called layers on the onion, what is the housing crisis in Vermont? Well, we all know right now it's impossible to buy a house. Young people can't afford it. You can't even find a place to rent.
Right.
And yet the alleged solution is building tens of thousands of housing units over the next 10 years.
Yeah.
So there's one estimate that we need 35,000 new units of housing in Vermont. That came from the Vermont Housing Finance Agency based upon a footnote in a U.S. Census document that projected we need 35,000 new units of housing. There's another study favored by a lot of the real estate people. We need 55,000 new units of housing. Now again, folks, this is over 10 years. One wonders, what does that do about the housing crisis in the year 2025?
Nothing.
Right. So throwing out the big numbers, right? So they say we need between 35 and 55,000 units over 10 years. Well, what about the here and now? Well, we do know two things. Here come two numbers, right? We do know over the last 10 to 15 years in Vermont, 10,000 housing units, apartments or houses, that full-time Vermonters could otherwise be living in. 10,000 of those units were converted to what's called short-term rentals.
Right, Airbnb.
You got it. So they immediately were taken out of the housing market for the people that live here in Vermont now.
Right.
For enormous profits for the people that own those units, right?
And most of them live out of state.
So I say to myself, well, what about the 10,000 units in the here and now? But the other thing that's interesting is the state was required to do a study on what other housing units are out there which otherwise would be available. So making the long story short, last year a report came in. There right now in Vermont, there's another 11,000 housing units, apartments and houses, classified vacant or abandoned, but they're not decrepit and falling down, not yet, which would otherwise be available. So you add up 10,000 and 11,000, and I say to myself, there's 21,000 units of housing available that should be available right now for Vermonters. Why aren't we renovating these and fixing them up? So one thing leads to another, like long time ago I was on the school board in Barry City, and we controlled the local VOC training center. Making the long story short, it was the era when everything was moving to digital this, digital that. And some of us said, well, what about the future plumbers and carpenters and electricians?
Oh,
Well. Well, now we have this enormous shortage, right? There is nobody to go out and renovate those vacant and abandoned houses because everybody dropped the ball on that.
Right.
So trying to make the long story short, so here we are now dealing with the housing crisis. There's the people over here that think building new units for the next 10 years is the solution. Some of us say, well, wait a minute, there's a better way to approach this in the here and now, and why aren't we doing that?
And the answer is why aren't, actually the real question is who benefits? Who's benefiting from where we are now?
You hit the nail on the head, because a lot of money is going to be made over the construction of those units.
Right.
Those 35 to 55,000 units. Now, you know, there are people going to be moving into Vermont because of climate change, which is a whole huge topic until itself.
Right.
And, you know, you cannot stop migration, at least so far in the United States.
Hey, we're working on it, apparently. All forms of it.
People will be moving to Vermont, as they have for decades and hundreds of years, right? But the question becomes, what policies is the General Assembly putting in place to safeguard existing residents from the tidal wave of people coming in? There's all these conflicting and competing policies which are not really being discussed. It's like housing. It's a crisis. Deregulate. And then also let the market control the solution. And you can hear this big downward spiral taking place.
And let's jump from crisis to crisis. Which crisis is the bigger crisis?
Right.
Which one, meaning really, which one is the noisiest?
Right.
Because we all respond to noise, apparently.
Right.
And we don't make realistic plans.
Now, another piece of the big, beautiful bill, this 170-page thing, was the dastardly appeal process for permits. Oh my God, you know, poor developers can't build anything because all the NIMBYs are appealing all the permits all the time.
Shocking.
And so the legislature's response to that over the years has been to increasingly whittle down public participation.
Yes.
How many people can participate in the appeals to begin with? You know, the starting
Not
gate.
many.
And then even if you are able to crawl over the initial hurdles and get into appeal process, which is all in the court system now, you get into this whole thing of lawyers, right? The whole thing of competing.
Yeah.
So a couple more numbers, right? How many appeals are there of all these NIMBYs out there? Well, the statistics are that in 2022, just as an example, out of the hundreds of Act 250 permits that are processed every year, literally hundreds of permits, you know how many are appealed in that year? 8. 8 were appealed. And how many of those 8 appeals had anything to do with housing?
None.
2.
Oh.
2. So 2 out of hundreds of applications. So one wonders, you know, well, where is the crisis here? Well, let's drill down a little bit deeper into the delays and all these allegations and stuff. When you get into the case studies, most of the delays, most of the torture that goes on for the public trying to participate is by the other side. It's by the law firms representing the developers who draw things out. It's the war of attrition. So, you know, one has to wonder, the people under the Golden Dome, in their effort to speed up appeals, reduce the NIMBYism and all, I look at this and say, you know, it seems to me they don't trust their own constituents. Their own people in their own towns that want to participate in their own destiny, the quality of life in their own community, are being more and more denied access to the appeal process. Now, we never hear anybody under the dome talking about curtailing or limiting the appeal rights of the developers, right?
No, not at all. Or any other business.
Developer will get a permit with conditions they don't like. Oh my God, I got to appeal. Legislature says, no problem, appeal it, you know?
Right.
So we got the pros and the cons, the yin and yang, what's going on here.
And we see the public excluded more and more, or reduced to, you can have 2 minutes to ask your question.
Right.
We won't give you an answer, but you can have 2 minutes. But we take your input so seriously.
You know, what's been lost in this state is a sense of the history of how all this happened. You know, the land use regulations we have in Vermont were created in 1970. And it was all created by, you ready for this, folks? A completely Republican legislature with a Republican governor. They were the people who had the sense to see what was happening, what could happen to the state of Vermont, quality of life. They're the ones that put all this stuff into place. It wasn't flaming liberals or radicals. It was a breed of what we would call the old Yankees. And they had a context for this. They had a context of the 100 years before that, when Vermont had been deforested, when there was over farming, we had massive amount loss of topsoil.
Yep.
They learned from that, and an environmental ethic, as a result, was created in Vermont. So you run the movie ahead, and those were the folks that passed these laws. Now, of course, there's too much regulation, some say. We have to cut back. Exactly at the time, we can see what's happening to the overall ecosystems, right?
Yes.
We have increased floods in Vermont. Why are those floods taking place? Might have something to do with overdevelopment here or deforestation over there, right?
And really moronic things like moving the path of rivers, which we did in Newport.
Right.
We moved the Clyde. I mean, are we really that stupid? Yes.
Same in Barrie. They moved
Yeah.
the Stevens Branch 100 years ago, and now
look
the
what
big debate
happened to
is
Barrie.
it really a river or is it a canal?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, it's mighty wet and it flooded the town, so there's a clue there. Yeah.
Yep.
So where do we go with that?
I think people have to be diligent in terms of their obligation to future generations.
Yeah.
There's a concept called intergenerational solidarity. That's quite a mouthful. But it's all about what is our responsibility for the people that come after us.
Right.
And some people just want to throw up their hands and say it's too late. But there's a moral imperative here, you know, to take care of the people that come after us. Back to the big, beautiful bill. There's a portion of that bill which deals with this word jurisdiction, which is basically when do I need to get an Act 250 permit? That's what jurisdiction means. And as I mentioned before, they created these exemptions. They say temporary, but they're for like 5 years for housing projects. But they also told this new board to go out and conduct a study on jurisdiction. And they used the word in the law tiers, not tiers, but T-I-E-R-S.
Levels.
Tiers, right. And so they said, we want you to come back and let us know whether we should, in the Golden Dome, change the way we do Act 250 jurisdiction. So, long story short, the legislature created tiers 1A and 1B. We won't get into where they came up with these number systems.
They're so creative.
Maybe a dartboard.
Yeah.
So tiers 1A and 1B, making it short, would become the free fire zones, for no Act 250 jurisdiction, because the theory is local government has total control, quality control over what's going on in these downtown development areas. There's all these fancy terms now for downtown development areas.
Yeah, we've learned them.
So all these areas would be exempt from Act 250 review. It would be up to development review boards to do the review. We can go on at length about the pros and cons of the quality of development review boards and why there are problems of quality there. But more to the point, there's tiers 2 and 3. Tier 2 is like, okay, tack it on the wall. We'll come back to tier 2 in a couple years after you tell us about tiers 1A and 1B, 1, 3, and tier 3. But I wanted to focus on tier 3 because tier 3 is a study that's underway right now to address the areas in Vermont which have been defined as critical natural resource areas. Critical natural resource areas really means finite natural resources. Only so much left, right? Never going to be able to create it again once it's gone.
Yeah.
So, in a nutshell, the critical natural resources areas include things like the aquifers for water supply, drinking water supplies,
Really important.
aquifers, headwaters of the rivers and the streams, which flow into our lakes and ponds, the headwaters. It deals with wildlife habitat areas, not only where the other species live, but travel corridors.
Yes.
The people, especially up here in the Northeast Kingdom, might be aware, for just as one example, black bears will travel 60 to 70 miles in these travel corridors to get to the seasonal feeding areas.
Yes.
Be they the mast where the beech nuts are and stuff like that, or springtime areas. But another critical natural resource area are the still existing forested expanses, which are known as the carbon sinks. They soak up the carbon, which is all about climate change, as well as retaining stormwater runoff. So there you have it, folks. These are the critical natural resources that should be protected. Now, here's the problem.
We're not.
We're not protecting them right now thoroughly. That's absolutely sure. And the approach that's going on now is to define these areas through mapping. Well, mapping. This gets us into the use of technology. I certainly see a use of mapping in terms of doing the review of the actual impacts.
Right.
But to use mapping to determine if someone's going to call up and say, do we need to get a permit? Well, future bureaucrats are going to have to ask, well, tell me the latitude and longitude of your property.
Right.
Now, how many people out here can tell me the latitude and longitude for their property, right? This would be a good quiz. I can't tell you from my property.
I can tell you we're lat 45, but that's as good as we get.
So I mention that because now, there could be a real administrative nightmare if they go down the wrong road on this thing.
And they probably
with Tier
will.
3, right? Which would be an unfortunate, tragic outcome because we do need to protect these areas.
Yes.
Act 250 in the beginning had black and white triggers. Do you need to get a permit?
Yeah.
And the Vermont Supreme Court said that makes sense. And it's really good that Act 250 has what's called bright lines for jurisdiction. Bright lines. Somebody could call up, and in 3 or 4 minutes, we used to be able to tell people on the phone whether or not you need to get a permit. And I did over 30 years working for the state, literally hundreds of these questions. Do I need to get a permit? Like that. Now it's going to become a much more difficult, arduous process to determine. But it doesn't have to be this way. Some of us think that a bright line would be simply using the 1,500-foot contour line. The 1,500-foot contour line lines up perfectly with aquifers, headwaters, habitat areas, forest expanses. Now, I want to hurry up and say, if the 1,500-foot contour was determined, that does not mean anybody above 1,500 feet will never be able to develop their land because of dastardly Act 250.
Right.
In fact, Act 250 has always been set up as a permitting process. For better or worse, it's a permitting process, not a denial process. When you go back and look at the numbers over 50 years of Act 250, less than 7% of all the applications were denied permits. So it is not a taking. It is not denying people the right of the use of their land. It's about shaping the use of the land to protect those finite natural resources.
Right.
I think the people of the Northeast Kingdom sit on a gold mine. This is where so many of the finite natural resources are left, right? And so you can look at that and say, like, well, all right, but it's my land, it's my private property rights. Well, that's true over here. But we come back to, well, what is the responsibility to the larger community that share in those natural resources, which might be on your private property? So the long story short is, I think the focus should be on developing a process where there would be a new bright line for jurisdiction, but a way to assist folks, especially in these rural areas, in going through the permit process. I don't think the threat is so much from development. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a lot of new ski areas or factories or general stores built above 1,500 feet in elevation. But there will be a lot of subdivision of land. And it's the subdivision of land, when you begin breaking up those parcels of land with all those natural resources on it, that's when you begin to get into a dangerous cycle of stripping the integrity of those resources. So that's what I think as a state we should be focusing on. I'm worried that we're not going to have that focus.
I think what you're saying makes absolute sense. And when we can apply that up here to what's happened with the landfill.
Right.
Which imperils our water, our aquifers.
Right.
All of the area up here. And I mean, where you're sitting right now, we're right on top of that area. I mean, it towers over us.
I'm glad you brought up the state's only landfill.
Correct.
Right up here in the Northeast Kingdom. Now that gets into another legislative failure, and that is the state of Vermont adopted in 1987 a whole bunch of new laws to deal with solid waste, and they were good laws. But the state policy adopted in 1987 for how we're going to deal with solid waste as a state doesn't mean anything anymore in the real world. It was all geared up that the municipalities would be in the driver's seat regarding solid waste. Well, we all know that's not true. That's not true, right? By default, it's happened into the hands of the private sector, News VT, otherwise known as Casella Incorporated.
Right.
So the policy should be upgraded, right?
Big time.
Other states are way ahead of Vermont. Vermont used to be in the vanguard of environmental regulation. No more. Other states are getting out in front of this. For example, Maine, as I understand it, passed laws that eventually the solid waste facilities will be state-owned and operated, which means only the solid waste, the sludge, all that stuff from within that state can go to these new landfills.
Right.
Not so in Vermont,
No.
because there's an ironic decision named City of Philadelphia versus State of New Jersey from 30, 40 years ago, in which the U.S. Supreme Court said garbage is protected by the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Right.
Which means that any private landfill in any state, such as Vermont, must accept waste from other states because it's commerce. Not to mention the tragic impacts on the people that live in this state where the landfill is, as we see here, right?
Day
Questions
after
of
day.
leachate, right?
The odors, and again, what you can smell is up in the air.
Right.
The-
Air emissions, right?
Right.
Not to mention all those trucks.
Trashing the roads,
That's right.
trashing people's hearing. I
Right.
mean, it's horrific. But corporations make out like the bandits they
Right,
are.
right.
And the state does really well, because that particular department of the state is pulling in some wonderful tax dollars.
But they do get application fees.
Yes.
Yeah, and
They also get paid a percentage of every tonnage.
correct.
I mean, that goes in, it doesn't go directly to ANR, but it
Right.
goes into the general coffers.
Right.
So where is the motivation to change this?
Right.
And a corporation that has shareholders,
Right.
their first loyalty is to the shareholders. And creating a little mini park in Newport, which was a, quote, gift to those of us living here,
Right.
is downright insulting. Oh, goody, I can sit in a little mini park and be poisoned at the same time. Oh, I like that. Not. We're crazy.
Well, you know, the landfill is a good example, too, about the challenges of authentic public participation in Vermont anymore.
Yeah.
Public participation, well, what forums are available? I mean, I suppose one could try and go to the Coventry Development Review Board to the extent they review anything regarding the landfill. And then there's the state review. Well, Act 250 under Governor Phil Scott isn't what it used to be. I don't want to shock anybody out there.
I'm shocked.
But, you know, there's been a degradation in the quality of the Act 250 process in terms of providing a public forum for the people that live up here
Yeah.
to evaluate the impacts. And then we finally get to the Agency of Natural Resources, which purports to have a public participation. Now, they issue solid waste certifications for the landfill. They issue discharge permits that deal with the leachate from the landfill, and they also deal with air emissions.
Yes.
But
In
the fact of
theory.
the matter is that it really is a hand in glove between the regulators and the corporation.
Yes.
And then a draft permit pops out, and then it's like, okay, folks, everybody out there now can participate with providing comments.
Yes.
And you go to these public meetings, they don't call them public hearings, and you comment to these people who have issued the draft permit. Sometimes you don't even get a response.
Yes.
It's very Orwellian. You know, they're
Yes.
sitting there listening. That's it. And then months, if not in one case, year went by, and then suddenly out pops the final permit with this document called Responsiveness Summary, and that's it. Your public comment is rolled in there. Somebody said, here's what we say in response. Thank you very much. Here's the permit. So the point is this. Then the public can try and appeal that. Good luck with that.
We've tried.
There's the issues of standing, all the
Yes.
preliminary issues. And here's where we get into the paradox, if not the hypocrisy. Because all of those preliminary appeals on land use issues and environmental issues are treated just as if it was a personal liability lawsuit or a
Right.
tort. And you go through all this legal morass and gobbledygook without ever getting to the substance of the issue. Because it's the war of attrition. Grassroots groups burn out, run out of money.
It's the money that and you cannot possibly compete with those deep pockets, and you know this better
Right.
than anybody.
Right,
And so do any of us here who have opposed the landfill.
right.
It's horrific.
But you know, the people in the Northeast Kingdom need to be conscious and aware of this because it's your community, it's your region,
Right.
it's your resources. It's not only Lake Memphremagog being threatened by leachate and all, but it's the air everyone breathes up here.
Right.
There are enormous amount of air emissions that come out of that landfill, even by the corporation's own admission. I think my memory tells me there's at least 26 substances emitted by the landfill, which are officially hazardous air contaminants.
Right.
26 hazardous air contaminants coming out of that landfill. You know, the long story made short is a lot of the solution is burning it, right? Flaring it off.
which creates problems of its own.
There you
big
go.
time. And if you look at the health results up here, the cancer levels are through the sky. But how do you prove that?
Right.
I mean, you can prove those cancer levels exist.
Right.
You can prove correlation between specific cancers and specific chemicals, but you cannot prove that that is the source.
Right.
It's very frustrating.
Right. Well, you know, the big concern, among others, with the landfill operation is, as we speak, the leachate has significant levels of PFAS
Right.
and other hazardous contaminants in it. And Casella Corporation, doing business as News VT Incorporated, is going through a process of a pilot system to pre-treat the leachate to knock down the levels of the PFAS.
Of some of the PFAS.
So to date, that company has spent $3 million for what's been called the empty building, a $3 million empty building with a lot of piping in it. Well, golly gee, we're going to put a pre-treatment system in there, but we don't really know what it was. This is a few years ago. Well, along comes a proposed pre-treatment system as a pilot. The corporation and A&R said, great, let's run the pilot and see what we can get. Well, this so-called pilot system is a $2 million investment. Legally, you can call it a fixture.
Yes.
So you have a $2 million fixture, big
Right.
treatment system, now put into the empty building, and really yet no forum for the public to be able to ask questions about
Right.
this, right? To participate in this.
Well, in theory, it hasn't even started
Right,
because the permitting isn't done,
right,
takes you right back to the first part of this loop.
right,
But here it sits, it's already treating leachate,
right,
and then what?
right.
And what comes next?
And what comes next? You know, we all know that since the Casella Corporation is a for-profit corporation,
Yes.
they have a business plan going over who knows how many years into the future, right?
Right.
Because it's a profit-driven corporation. It's America. That's what business is all about. On this hand, when do the people in the Northeast Kingdom get an opportunity to see that master plan?
Never.
For example, is the pilot pre-treatment system, $2 million worth of hardware up there right now, going to become the permanent pre-treatment system? And is the capacity of that well beyond the needs of that landfill in Coventry, Vermont?
Right.
In other words, will leachate be imported from other facilities for pre-treatment there?
Well, it's funny you should mention that because just across the border in New Hampshire, the Bethlehem landfill, which has been a disaster from the get-go, is actually closing.
Right.
But this same company wants to open a new one right on the shores of a pristine lake, Forest Lake.
Yeah.
Now, that group has organized itself in ways that are just incredible. One person has turned his entire life into a career to spearhead that. Just amazing. And it looks like they have defeated Casella into building a landfill there. But I will bet you anything the plan was to bring leachate from both Forest Lake, if that landfill ever happened, and Bethlehem, because they're going to have leachate from there for the next 30 years.
Right.
Trotting it across just above Island Pond, bringing
Right.
it the Route 3 way, all the way across to us.
Right.
And who would even know?
Right. Right, and so one question leads to the next question. So
Yes.
if this pilot pre-treatment system becomes a permanent system, is it only for the landfill in Coventry or for imported? But then the question becomes, well, where does the pre-treated leachate go next?
Right.
So right now, it gets trucked to the City of Montpelier wastewater treatment plant, which gets discharged into the Winooski River.
And into Lake Champlain.
That's right. There is a temporary, quote-unquote, moratorium against the use of the Newport wastewater
Right.
treatment system, which in turn would discharge into Lake Memphremagog,
Right.
which, by the way, is the drinking water supply for at least 150,000 people north of the border.
175,000. Yeah.
So the question becomes, putting all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together, what is the master plan? You know, does Casella intend to say, once we get a permanent pretreatment system, we will then circle back and begin to see if we can use the Newport wastewater treatment facility. It's important for people to realize a pre-treatment system doesn't remove all the bad stuff at all.
Not even close.
That's right. A lot of the bad stuff will then go into the Newport wastewater treatment system.
Yeah.
And here's the question. How much of that bad stuff really gets removed by any municipal wastewater treatment system?
It can't.
Right.
And then it can be discharged straight into the lake.
Right.
Goes because our waters flow north.
Right.
It can go up into Sherbrooke. 25% of the lake is in Vermont. 75% is in Canada.
Right.
If we do that, we are poisoning another country's drinking water.
Right.
That's an act of war.
So some people say, well, if the wastewater treatment plants don't really remove all the bad stuff,
Yeah.
how can this be happening? And the answer is, for many years, in the eyes of some of the regulators, the answer has been dilution's the solution.
To pollution.
Dilution's the solution, right?
Yes,
That there be
it's
the
not.
mixing of the discharge of the effluent into a body of water, and it'll
Dissipate.
disappear.
And be harmless. It's not.
But on a serious note, this is the question that the decision makers, the legislators up in this part of the state should be out front in protecting the interest of the community. I don't live up here. I live in Barrie, but I can tell you I don't really see that level of protection which really should be putting in place now.
I live here, and our local senator is a realtor. So when the legislation was asked to consider Lake Memphremagog as a lake in crisis,
Right.
I'll bet you he wasn't a big supporter of that.
Right.
And then we have Coventry, who make a lot of money off Casella being there.
Right.
So where's their motivation?
Right.
And we may be a small population, but we can be loud.
Right.
It's not okay. What we don't seem to be very effective yet at is voting them out.
Right.
And voting people in who really will protect us up here.
And you need people to run for office
Yes.
too, right? That's another problem.
Oh, yeah.
But John, you brought up the Lake and Crisis Bill,
Yeah.
which is another topic. And the topic is bills that get introduced by legislators. And on an average year in Vermont, about 600 bills get introduced in the legislature, 600 bills. At the end of every biennium, I might be a little off with the number here, out of that 600, about 100 at the most make it to the finish line. So what about those other 500? So the Lake and Crisis Bill. A couple years ago, there was a bill introduced by legislators from this part of the state to deal with updating the state's solid waste. It was a half-baked bill to begin with, that was going to allegedly deal with the old solid waste policy. Didn't go anywhere. Those bills which get introduced, those 500 out of the 600 are called constituent bills. Constituent bills are bills introduced by a legislator to demonstrate to the people that vote for them, I'm doing
That they
something
care,
for you, right?
I care.
But a bill needs to be moved through the process.
Right.
You can't just introduce a bill and hope that the tooth fairy or someone else is going to come in and do the hard work of moving the bill. In Montpelier, the expression is the bill stays on the wall, because if you've ever been to Montpelier to the hearing rooms or the committees, they have these bulletin boards
Yes, they do.
with little index cards for each bill, and they get tacked onto the bulletin board. The goal would be to get your bill off that board, to have a hearing before that committee,
Right.
get the committee to pass the bill, move it to the House, move it to the Senate. If none of that happens to that bill, that's called a constituent bill. That's the problem.
And there it stays.
And there it stays.
And while it's really easy to blame those we elect, what we still have to factor into that is they all have day jobs.
Right.
And
Right.
are we being fair in what we ask of them if they really have to work in the way that they do? And they're only there for 6 months of the year.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up. You know, it's so challenging for young people, people who have jobs and families to go to the legislature. We have a legislature that's top heavy with retired people like me.
And me. All right.
And, you know, everybody should have a level of representation. But in terms of
Absolutely.
what we were discussing a few minutes ago, the moral imperative to act on behalf of the community of future generations, the future generations need a place at the table.
Right.
To establish what's the priority, what's the urgency.
Yeah. And then we have to inject a little reality into that, because one of the ways that a lot of people got unelected recently was that they pushed for a bill and got it passed that made sense up here.
Right.
But on the ground, certainly for this part of the world where we couldn't afford the changes they wanted,
Right.
it blew it out of the water, and those people all got unelected.
Right.
And there were some good things in that bill,
Right.
and some that were awful.
You know, I had a mentor when I was growing up, and the mentor passed away a few years ago, and it was a Jesuit priest, and you know, he was asked, well, where do you get hope, a source of hope in the 21st century, given all these issues? And
Yeah.
and then in response, he never really addressed the concept of hope. He said that the virtue that's important in the 21st century to address the issues we face, the virtue is called perseverance.
Yeah.
People of goodwill need to put their shoulder to the wheel to address these issues.
And keep it there.
So the topics we're talking about today could have people throw up their hands in despair, saying it's hopeless.
No.
Far from it.
It's
You know, this all can be dealt with effectively when people begin to get up the curve of consciousness, realizing this stuff, stepping up to the plate and becoming involved.
Right.
Public participation is the answer.
Yeah. And then you get asked, well, how do I become involved? I try and go to the hearings. I try to ask questions.
Right.
I'm limited to 2 minutes. I can rant in my 2 minutes. And then what?
Right,
And it's a good question.
right,
That's not a reason to not keep doing it, though.
right. Well, it's about leveling the playing field. For example, with the Agency of Natural Resources permits, many people don't realize this, but in Vermont, a lot of the efforts about clean air and clean water originate from the federal Clean Air and Clean Water Acts.
Yes.
And Vermont is delegated the responsibility, as are other states, to administer the federal Clean Air and Clean Water Acts that passed in the 1970s. Vermont can add, any state can add more quality to that,
Right.
but the minimum is the clean air and clean water. So I only mention that because the process about appeals and all, a lot of that goes back to, well, what does the federal government require, you know, for doing that? But, you know, as we run the movie ahead, particularly with concern about the big, beautiful bill that passed in Washington, with funding cuts coming down the road, people may not be aware that approximately 50% of the budget of the Agency of Natural Resources is federal money,
Right.
because we are administering the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. So therefore, Uncle Sam sends money to do that type of work.
Right.
When that money is eliminated, what's going to happen when we lose approximately 50% of the workforce in the Agency of Natural
We're going to have
Resources?
to do it ourselves.
Who will be there to do it? Or
It's a
will
very good
anybody do it?
question. Very
You know,
good
the big
question.
concern of some of us former regulators is that we'll switch to what's called general permitting. And general permitting is different from actually scrutinizing a proposal by a developer and specificity, the way it's done now. General permitting is, okay, developer, you hire a consultant or engineer that's going to put his John or Jane Hancock on the plans and certify,
Yeah.
and we're going to take your application fee to process it, and we're just going to approve it under the general permit. And then in theory, the state then follows up on enforcement and quality control.
Right.
Well, I can go on at length about how that's a fantasy, because the state did changes to the laws for septic systems years ago, reduced the amount of upfront review by state engineers of proposed septic systems, and the idea was that the focus would be on checking those septic systems once they're in the ground. Never happened. Not that I'm saying we're going to send the Act 250 police out to check people's septic systems.
There are no Act 250 police.
Well, there you go.
Forgot that.
What is reality?
Yeah. But the reality is we do have very few checks and balances.
Right.
So we have a lot of hype about what the problem is, and you and I may agree on a lot of this. Clearly the state doesn't agree on some of it.
Right.
And the public doesn't have enough information and has no way of getting it.
Right. I felt for many years that a big problem in the state of Vermont is that this information that we're talking about is not made readily available to Vermonters when they're going through the school system.
Right.
Because when those people graduate high school and college, they become the taxpayers and the residents of the state. They need to be engaged in all that process so they understand
all the way
it
along.
all along. But it doesn't happen.
Right.
You know, there's never been an Act 250 curriculum in high schools or colleges in the state. How would anybody really know how all these pieces fit together? There's no way of knowing about public participation.
And there's a sort of undercurrent of regulations are bad. Regulations are just there to get in your way.
Right.
Well, that may be true for some, but it's certainly not true for the majority.
Right.
Their original intent was about protection.
Correct.
So how do we keep protection?
Right.
And how do we inform people? Newport's struggling with the same thing right now. We've been in a lot of financial turmoil here.
Right.
We're going to have to go back to citizens for a vote. But how do citizens make an informed choice here, assuming there is a choice, without information? And hearing things like, well, they could come to these meetings. Yeah, right. They could read the newspapers. Well, they could if there was anything in them that was really giving them common sense reporting, but it's not. How do they get enough information to make that kind of decision? They could call somebody who's part of the decision making. Well, A, they have to know that's an option, and B, they have to have a phone number.
Right.
I mean, they could go onto social media, along with all of the rest of the hype there.
Right.
How do you sort out what's real and what isn't?
Well, you know, social media brings up the topic of attention span.
Right.
In this day and age we live in, you know, everyone on their various devices, all the studies are indicating that as human beings, our attention span is dwindling, right? What is it now, like 3-4 minutes?
Yeah, something pathetic like that.
But I think on the other hand, you know, youth, when they particularly are focused on stuff like this, can really persevere and can really get involved in this because they realize what their destiny is going to consist of.
I hope so. And I think, I mean, this is a sort of good place to end, even though you and I could go on forever here. How do we get the next step, which is, this is your destiny. Right. This is your planet. My generation, our generation is screwing up.
Right.
We didn't start off intending to do that.
Right.
But somehow here we are.
Right.
Here you are. You're the ones going forward.
Right.
How do you get involved? How do you take over? Because you're going to have to take over. You're going to have to kick us out.
Well, speaking as a boomer, baby boomer myself, I
Correct.
think it's an intense responsibility of the baby boomers to step up to address this issue.
Yes.
You know, baby boomers had a glimpse of how things could have been different 50, 60 years ago.
Yes.
There really was that period of time.
There was. And we blew
Some
it.
people continued working on that
Yes.
goodwill on behalf of the larger community. Others said, what's in it for me? A lot of boomers are passing, right? But not everyone yet. And so all of us that have grandkids out there, now is the time to step up to the plate and realize the responsibility is there to try and get these children
Teach your grandkids.
Right. Teach your children well.
That's what I was just thinking, and I was hearing the music. Well, I guess on that note, we really do have to end. Will you come back? And
I will.
Preferably not in 2 years. We might be too old then to even be able to hold a conversation.
I love the drive up Route 14,
Yeah.
except when I see the NBI trucks. But
Everywhere.
today I counted
Blocking
15 heading south as I was coming north at 9 o'clock in the
When
morning.
my partner and I drive down to Burlington for everything, I count the trucks. And, you know, as each one passes, I'm going, 6, 7. She's getting so mad next to me. Stop it. Anyway, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Going to do this again.
Okay.